Today, Nally Elementary would like to recognize all of our November Leaders of the Month. We are so proud of these students and their outstanding leadership in the classroom, playground, lunchroom, and they are always displaying the 7 habits here at Nally School. Today, I will recognize each student in each grade level and tell you a little something about them. Okay, starting off in kindergarten, we have Kenson Hartman, who was nominated by Mrs. Craig. Mrs. Craig said he is proactive, puts first things first, and synergizes. Kenson has been working hard adjusting to the expectations in kindergarten. This is a tall order for some of the friends, but not for Kenson. He is a good listener in class. Mrs. Craig said she appreciates how he always tries his best. Way to go, Kenson. In Mrs. Parton's room, we have Marley McAleese, who is proactive. Marley lights up the classroom with her kind heart and bright smile. She leads by example, and others always look up to her. She truly makes the classroom a better place. In Mrs. Rankin's room, we have Bodie Slutz. Bodie has adjusted to the kindergarten classroom fairly quickly. He leads by example and now raises his hand instead of shouting out. Keep on shining, Bodie. In Mrs. Zukowski's room, we have Theo Porter, who is proactive and thinks win-win. Mrs. Z said Theo chooses kindness daily in the classroom. He can be seen making room for friends in the talking stick circle, including others in play, and he always helps clean up, even if it wasn't his mess. Kindness will lead all things you do in life. Keep up the great work, Theo. Nominated by Mrs. Tucker and Mrs. Zukowski is Leland Millis. Leland is proactive and puts first things first. Leland sets a great example in both Mrs. Tucker's room and Mrs. Zukowski's class. He can consistently be found listening to directions, working hard, and putting forth his best effort. We are very happy to have Leland here at Nolly. All right, in first grade, our first student is Cole Farhat, who is proactive and puts first things first. Cole has been a total rock star by putting first things first this year. He comes to school with such an amazing attitude and ready to work. Mrs. Beard said, I am so proud of him for choosing to practice his reading before starting his day. Way to go, Cole. In Mrs. Bowser's room, we have Casey Mydock, who demonstrates all habits. Mrs. Bowser said Casey is helpful and kind to all of her classmates. She always sets a good example for others to follow. Keep it up, Casey. In Miss Nagy's room, we have Elliot Richardson, who begins with the end in mind and puts first things first. Elliot demonstrates leadership every day in the classroom. She always puts pride in her work. She helps others and is kind to all. We vote for Leader of the Week in our classroom, and the students recognized and selected Elliot first this school year. In Mrs. Rector's room, we have Bryn Ross, who is proactive. Bryn Ross is a proactive leader in the first grade classroom. Anytime Mrs. Rector's class is in the hallway, Mrs. Rector said she can count on Bryn to be quiet and to always do the right thing. Keep it up, Bryn. Okay, moving on to second grade, our first student is in Mrs. Grandin's room, and it is Cooper McGraw. Cooper puts first things first. Cooper is a hard worker. He puts first things first by completing his work and participating in class. Way to go, Cooper. In Mrs. Slimak's room, we have Gavin Porco, who is proactive and puts first things first. Mrs. Slimak said Gavin comes in each day ready to go. He puts first things first and takes action to always complete his work. He can always be found helping others as well. Keep up the great work, Gavin. In Mrs. Truax's room, we have Ava Coleman. Ava displays responsibility, problem solving, and empathy. She motivates and inspires her peers while always being a good listener. Keep up the great work, Ava. In Mrs. Van Dorsten's room, we have Lucas Conan, who synergizes. Lucas has started off this year in the right direction. Lucas tries hard and works well with all of his classmates. He is always kind and respectful to everyone. Way to go, Lucas. In third grade, in Mrs. Braley's room, we have Rennick Smith. Rennick demonstrates all of the 7 habits. Mrs. Braley said Rennick demonstrates all of the 7 habits so far this year. He is a quiet leader in our classroom and a positive role model. Every day he takes charge of his learning. He is prepared and on task. Rennick is always respectful to others and lends a helping hand to teachers and classmates. Thank you, Rennick, for spreading kindness in room 301. In Mrs. Esterly's room, we have Liam B., who synergizes. Mrs. Esterly said Liam does a great job of treating everyone with kindness. He never complains and he gives respect to other students. Liam is a great example of how to synergize with other students. Thank you for being a leader, Liam. In Mrs. Stasnis's room, we have Mackenzie Knox, who puts first things first. Mackenzie is another strong leader in our classroom. She works hard, follows directions, and is kind and polite. From the first day, she has been ready to go in third grade. Keep doing great things. In Mr. Straub's room, we have Axel Salter, who begins with the end in mind and puts first things first. Axel is really emerging as a leader in our classroom. He is a very hard worker. He is not afraid to make mistakes and he tries new strategies. He maintains a growth mindset and is a very good problem solver. Keep up the great work, Axel. Mrs. Sweeter nominated Tansy Martin, who is proactive. Tansy is a true leader in our class. She steps up and helps others often. She is excited to come to class each day and is always prepared to learn. Keep up the amazing work, Tansy. Okay, moving on to fourth grade. Our first student is Riker Clusty, who is nominated by Mrs. Gardner and Mrs. Hansel. Riker is proactive, begins with the end in mind, and puts first things first. The teacher said Riker is off to a great start in fourth grade. He is a good friend, he listens in class, and works hard every single day. He is a leader in room 405. Way to go, Riker. In Mrs. Matson's room, we have Riker Vincent, who puts first things first. Riker is a very responsible student. He comes to school prepared and does his work well, and he does it on time. Keep being a great leader, Riker. In Mrs. Oakes' room, we have Levi McGraw, who is proactive. Levi was actually nominated by a fellow student who was impressed with his kindness and willingness to help a friend in need. Mrs. Oakes said, I am proud of his actions and proud of him for being such a great role model in her class. In Mrs. Toth's room, we have Colton Zimmer, who puts first things first. Colton is doing a great job in fourth grade. He is always prepared for class and his homework is done each day. Mrs. Toth said, I like the way Colton puts first things first. Way to go, Colton. And finally, our fifth graders. Our first student is in Mrs. Adamson's room, and it is Jace Seroyd for putting first things first. Mrs. Adamson said, Jace is a positive role model in class. He is always prepared, completes his assignments, and puts first things first. I appreciate his hard work and kindness in my class. And that was from Mrs. Adamson. From Mrs. Bellis, we have Grayson Porco. Grayson always begins with the end in mind. He works hard on his academics and is helpful to his teachers and classmates. Mrs. Bellis said, I am so proud of Grayson's efforts so far this school year. From Mrs. Demrosky, we have Miles Paraso, who puts first things first. Miles Paraso is being nominated for using Habit 3, putting first things first. Miles is always on task in class and uses his classwork time and study hall time to complete assignments. Miles definitely knows how to prioritize his time and sets a great example for others. Keep up the great leadership, Miles. From Mrs. Sewell's class, we have Alexa Demrosky. Alexa is proactive. Alexa works so hard to get all of her work done on time or even early. She is organized and a total go-getter. And finally, from Mrs. Maggard's room is Jagger Slutz for putting first things first. Jaggard completes all of his assignments and takes his time to complete his work. We appreciate your hard work, Jagger. Congratulations to all of the NALI Leaders of the Month. The entire staff here at NALI is so proud of you. Please keep up the great work and your outstanding leadership. Way to go!